Okay, Vidyashankar, please start the session.
Okay. Good morning, friends. Welcome all of you to this morning session organized by Fipresci-India. Most of you are aware that Fipresci is a global organization. It is an international federation of film critics. We have membership across the world. Film critics are there in all parts of the world. And in fact, it is one of the oldest film organizations in the world. It started in 1930, as early as 1930. And in 1992, the India chapter of the Fipresci was started by none other than Mr. Chidanand Dasgupta, in whose memory we are having this session today. Mr. Chidanand Dasgupta, as you all know again, is that one of the pioneering film critics of this country and a close associate of Mr. Satyajit Roy. And he is one of the very significant contributors to the growth of evolution of film criticism in India. He established this organization, the Indian chapter of Fipresci International, in 1992, and since then it has been very active. We have approximately about 40 members in India and from all parts of the country. And Fipresci is involved in basically in terms of film criticism is one of its major, as the name itself suggests, it's a body of film critics. Even though at individual level, we are doing film criticism and film journalism across India, we are also involved in film education across now. In the last few years, we have been conducting film appreciation courses. We have been publishing quarterly magazine. We are publishing annually. We are publishing books, and therefore we are involved in the spread of film culture in a big way, the healthy film culture in a very big way. And in the last 4 years, when in the centenary year of Mr. Chidanand Dasgupta, he was born in 1921, and from 2021 we have been having this annual lecture on film criticism, or generally on spread of film culture across the country. And we have had, this is the fourth session we are having. In addition to this session on film criticism and discussion on film criticism, we also are conducting an annual competition, particularly for young film critics, and we have been awarding cash prizes for one of the best film. We have our own team of panel members in the Fipresci members who evaluate this criticism which we receive from across the country. We have no restriction on that. Whichever film they can write on, they can write and send it to us. We put a team from our Fipresci to evaluate it, and this year we have 3 distinguished members: Mr. Meghchandra Kungba from Manipur, Mr. Pranjal Bora is a film academician from Assam, and we have Mr. Sridevi Arvind from Kerala, who is also an academician in cinema. These 3 distinguished film critics evaluated this year's submissions we received for the competition. And before announcing the result of this year's competition, before going into today's lecture I will introduce Professor Manu Chakravarthy after this announcement of the results of this year's competition. And before that, we have one of the members of the jury who evaluated this year's submissions. I request Mr. Pranjal Bora, who was part of this evaluation process, to speak a few words about the kind of submissions we received this year, and also his view on what the film criticism is, where it is heading towards, and how it is, what is the status of film criticism in India today. Because most of the submissions we receive are from young people who are just either entered the field of criticism or who have, who are in the process of writing afresh about films. Therefore, I request Mr. Pranjal Bora say a few words before we get into the main event today of the lecture, the annual lecture on. Please.
Well, right at the outset, sir, I express my gratitude to you people to repose faith in me as a member of the jury. As I have already revealed to you people, it was truly a very refreshing experience, sort of an enlightening as well, in the sense that most of the participants, they showed certain rare skills in develop in devising their ideas, presenting their ideas, their perspectives and all. And it was really a very enlightening experience, also in the sense that all of them did so well. We were almost at a loss, especially me. We were three jury members, and we did not really talk to each other. We did everything independently. But it is interesting to discover later that virtually all of us opted for the same participants. We were impressed with the way they presented themselves. Good to see that all of them have good film perspectives, good film sense. But one area I would like all of them to focus on is aesthetics, film aesthetics. In none of their writings, in none of their write-ups, could I see an equilibrium between their content analysis and the technical analysis. There was very little about the technical aspect of the pieces they opted for. I would like to request them, I would like to call upon them to work on that area in the times to come and try to come up with sort of balanced approaches. And I'm not going to say that whatever they have done this year is not sufficient, but wish they could do a little bit more justice to the technical excellences of the films they choose. Best of luck for all of them. Again, it is good to discover some of the participants were there also last year. They also did last year also. I want them to continue. Best of luck.
Thank you, Mr. Panjal Bora.
Yeah.
Mr. Premendra, should we announce the result now?
Yes, you can announce, please.
Yeah. Thank you. And on behalf of Fipresci International India chapter, I am announcing the following is the final result according to merit of the 4th CDG competition, that is Mr. Chidanand Das Gupta competition for best film criticism. Best award, the first, we have given about 5 certificate of merit awards this year, and 2 main awards, because that is usually we announce 2 awards only, but every year we find that the quality of film criticism needs some more recognition, and we decided from the very first event itself to issue certificate of merits to people who our juries felt that should be considered. And I will start with the 5 certificates of merit that has been issued. Certificate of merit certificate issued to Mr. Johnson Rajkumar from Impal, Manipur. He has written a criticism on Our Home, Manipuri film, directed by Romi Maitai. Then a certificate of merit is issued to Ashwini Jain from Karnataka. So the film she has written about is Kantara. That is the Kannada film directed by Mr. Rijab said it made a pan-Indian presence, this film. Then certificate of merit is issued to Rhythm Mandal from Kolkata for the criticism he has written on Kadai Sai Vivasai, that is a Tamil film directed by Mr. M. Manikandan. Certificate of merit is also issued to Mr. Ashish Dwivedi from Lucknow. These are all very young people, they are all in 20s. Okay. Film is Kadal. Katai. One second.
It is Kathal.
It's a Hindi film by Yashovardhan Mishra. Another certificate of merit is issued to Mr. Kalpajyoti Bhuyan from Guwahati, Assam, for the film Yemudi Pudi, Assamese, directed by Kulanandini Mahanta. These are the 5 certificate of merits issued on behalf of Fipresci this year. And that the second best award goes with a cash prize of 4,000 rupees and a certificate to Aditya Modak from Agartala, Tripura. The film reviewed is the popular Hindi film Pathan, directed by Mr. Siddharth Anand. And the best award, the award of with a cash prize of rupees 6,000 and a certificate of merit goes to Ms. Sragdhara Malini Dosh from Kolkata. The film is Jhili, the Bengali film by Ishan Ghosh. Thank you and congratulations to all of you. I'm very happy that if you see the result, there is a pan-Indian from across the country. People who have contributed to this year's competition have been awarded, and I'm very happy that there is a pan-Indian growth of film criticism and responses to film, and the film appreciation is indeed developing in a very positive and healthy way. Thank you, all of you, for submitting, and congratulations once again to all the winners. Premendra, would you like to say anything?
No, we shall send the certificates to all the winners, and all the articles which got the awards and the certificates of merits will be published in eCine India.
Okay.
So the result you already have listened. She has announced the first award went to Srogdhara Malini Das from Kolkata. Second, Aditya Modok from Agartala. Next, Johnson Rajkumar from Manipur, Imphal. Then Ashwini Jain from Kannada. She is from Ujire, Karnataka. Then Ridhim Mondal from Kolkata. Then Ashish Dwivedi from Lucknow, and Kalpojyoti Bhuiya from Guwahati. So congratulations to everybody. Okay, please continue.
Okay. Now we'll cover today's event. This event has also, as I mentioned to you, we started in 2021, the centenary year of Mr. Chidanand Das Gupta. And this is the fourth lecture. The first lecture was delivered by Ms. Aruna Vasdev, who is also a pioneering film critic and who is promoting Asian cinema and is also an academician. And the second was done by Mr. M.K. Raghavendra, who is again a film scholar and also a he has published books and is now internationally known across the world for his writings on cinema, and he's also a Fipresci member. The third was addressed by Mr. Shanmugh Das from Kerala, who is again a film academician. And now today we have a distinguished professor, Professor Manu Chakravarthy, who also happens to be a member of Fipresci-India. And I would like to introduce to him because I personally also know him for almost 4 decades now. He's an intellectual of immense persuasion in various domains. Hailing from a very distinguished scholarly family from Karnataka, he navigates and he traverses different linguistic disciplines. He's an authority both in 3 languages, English, Sanskrit, and Kannada, and his writings have spread across various domains. He's not only a film critic and a literary critic, he can also speak with authority on philosophy, religion, science, sociology, political science, and he's an intellectual of immense diversity of it's basically I would call him also an epistemologist, in the sense that all theories of knowledge is within his persuasion. And as far as cinema is concerned, he has not only he has writes both in English and Kannada. He has written extensively on literature, music. Music is another area of his persuasion. He has written on feminist politics. He has written on cinema extensively. He has authored insightful articles on Iranian cinema, Indian cinema, of course, and the preoccupations and creative impulse of eminent directors like Girish Kasarvadi. He has written perceptively about major figures of Kannada cinema, including the well-known popular actors like Ashwath, Dr. Rajkumar, and Anant Nag. He has the titles of some of his articles are reviewing Iranian cinema, imaging the oppressed, of icons and the spirit of the times. In fact, today's topic is about the spirit of the times and the cosmology of cinema. Then he has written about the marginalized as the invisible, the lensing the middle class spirit, are some of his conceptual writings on cinema. His writings seek to project the deep humanism and concern that guide the creativity underlying films as work of art. He's deeply concerned about because the film doesn't get the same kind of intellectual attention as much as literature or other forms of art. Therefore, he's very clear about the fact that cinema also needs to be interrogated in intellectual terms strongly, and therefore he has been in the last few years but he's published a book, very big book on all the media aspect, like as I mentioned, literature, music, fine arts, and other things. But his focus on cinema is now very deep in the last few years. Thank you, Manu, for accepting our request to do this lecture. And please go ahead. The platform is yours now. Thank you.
Good morning, friends. I thank Fipresci for inviting me to deliver this talk, and in particular to Premendraji Vidyashankar and the members of the Executive Council. In fact, I've entitled this presentation The Spirit of the Times and the Cosmology of Cinema. Now, at the very outset, I need to explain the nature of my premise. I attempt to deal with the two fundamental components. And these fundamental components constitute the thrust of my position. On one hand, I try to, as briefly as possible, foreground the significance of the forces of history, what I would call the historical, social, cultural, political, and economic forces. In fact, these forces decisively influence creative processes, as we know, not just cinema, but literature, painting, music, sculpture. And they also shape forms of expression of creative efforts. So we do know that there are certain dominant spirits of certain times that we generally call zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. And the dominant spirit of the times manifests itself in philosophical and creative texts. But at the same time, for me, what's necessary is it's important to recognize how creative processes retain a degree of autonomy, and they remain autonomous in the sense that they operate through intuitive and imaginative areas. So even as they open themselves up to larger areas of historical developments that surround them, no creative work, no text for that matter remains outside of the historical frame of the powerful transitions that historical changes bring in human consciousness. There is no text that's outside of this historical framework. So all creative journeys, intellectual journeys are embedded in temporal realities, in time and space, specific boundaries of spatio-temporal realities. This is what we recognize as the spirits of the times. However, what is important is to recognize two important aspects in the transactions between history and creativity. So what I'm trying to suggest is that imaginative and intellectual endeavors, broadly speaking, have two trajectories, and I shall briefly refer to them. The first is that creative and intellectual negotiations with history could also at one level mean internalizing certain dominant strains of ideas, the powerful ideas of the times, and in that sense, subscribing to them, regarding them as very important civilizational values, they may begin to uphold those dominant influential ideas of the times. In this sense, creative explorations, intellectual ideational explorations can become ideological. It only means that creative explorations, intellectual discourses can also act as strong vehicles that carry the ideological elements of their times. This is one aspect of the negotiation. On the other hand, and this interests me more than the first, the other hand, creative explorations, even as they carry ideological currents of the period, do not yield, do not succumb to the pressures exerted on them by these ideas. In fact, they interrogate, and this is my attempt in this presentation. In fact, very importantly, creative endeavors interrogate and subvert the dominant ideological issues of their times, the ruling ideas of the historical context. What this suggests for many like me is that great creative works, and I include literature, sculpture, music, painting, and certainly cinema, which is the focus of this talk, they do employ socio-political and cultural ideas. They negotiate with the ideas of their times, but they do not become mere representations or reflections. So they are not passive representations, reflections of these ideas. Creative works do use ideational patterns, and that's only to signify the historical situation. But as I mentioned earlier, through intuitive, imaginative, and aesthetic layers, we do notice a strong subversion. And it is this realm that truly transcends. So even as they're located in specific units of time and space, they do transcend the controlling structures of history. This is to say that they work through history, they turn their attention to all the twists and turns of historical influences, but eventually they unfold alternative visions of life through their creative process. It only means that to look at these works would mean having a revelation, an unfolding of multiple realities and contrasting approaches to histories. Creative works turn to the, this is only because my argument is that creative works turn to the rich and diverse experiential realities of human beings, of communities, and refuse to bend to specific ideological positions. In a sense, they constantly reject ideological reductionism. This is the reason why no significant creative work can be pinned down by any ideological position, however strong, powerful, and dominant it may be. You know, it's for this reason that ideological readings of literary and cinematic texts, however useful they may be up to a certain point, in my opinion, they fail to come to terms with the ambivalent visions of creative texts. And these ambivalent visions strongly refuse to be crippled by any kind of dogma. It is this resistance to dogma that interests me. When creative works dig deep into the intuitive, imaginative, and experiential dimensions of human beings, not that they come just out of the creator, but they dig into those elements of what we could even call insouciance of individuals they portray. They open themselves up to the infinite possibilities of human consciousness. And quite often they do create experiences and visions that may be truly antithetical to one another. So within it's not just a simplistic opposition to ideology, but within a single work of art, a text of cinema, a cinematic text, you begin to see counterpositions, contrapuntal positions, and this is important. The greatest danger of academic film studies of theory, especially guided by the American academia, is the tendency, they create the tendency to read cinematic texts through ideological and theoretical constructs. In fact, they become entrapments, theoretical enframements of the diversities of cinematic texts. It is this theoretical entrapment, ideological reductionism, that the cosmos of cinema, cosmos envisioned by great cinematic texts, contest and they confront it. In other words, history, historical processes, sociological transitions do not have a direct, linear, horizontal role to play in the lives of individuals who live in various kinds of communities that are richly plural in spirit. And in trying to capture these, does cinema as a work of art overcome these historical, ideological, theoretical entrapments? Now, my whole argument, to stretch it a little more, is that the contradictory, paradoxical qualities of human consciousness, in fact, they remain to a large extent inscrutable and unfathomable, and which is entrapped, enframed, reduced by theoretical jargon. And therefore, my argument is that even if we look at layers of history, layers of ideas, I would come up with an expression saying that there is something of a metaphysical dimension to human experience, metaphysical dimensions that cannot be theorized. And these metaphysical dimensions also come from the quality of ontology, that there are these essences of human beings, not a single, this metaphysical dimension. Now, when I talk of metaphysical dimension, I'm not referring to metaphysics, which is very different. I'm talking of the metaphysical in relation to experience, in relation to suffering, misery. So I mean metaphysical in a real earthly sense, not in an obscure, esoteric sense. Let me make that clear. And therefore, there are many strange realities that are outside of the framework of our intellectual ideational positions. I therefore, after this initial statement, turn to now, because I have layered this, I've divided it into several phases, but I shall try to find illustrations, and the first attempt for me would be to turn to this predominance of social realism, of this quality of social realism that seems to be very, very important. The relationship between cinema or any art form for that matter and realism. This raises questions about social realism, reality, what is reality, how do we apprehend reality, such very, very, very important and very disturbing questions that we cannot easily settle. Therefore, I begin with this question of social realism, and I begin my presentation with a specific reference to begin with to the European Western tradition. I shall turn to other contexts later on, and towards the end, I shall come to the Indian tradition. My illustrative segment begins with the Russian masters. In fact, I name Eisenstein, Dauzenko, Pudovkin, Vertov. I pass through them to the Armenian Sergei Parajanov, and I end with Tarkovsky. Given this span of time, I'm sure you all would recognize the fact that one cannot go on and on. So I use only specific illustrations. My chief aim is to show that the cosmos of cinema did have strong negotiations with politics, did not keep the political out of its ambit, but did not allow, as I've been mentioning, any political ideology to dominate its thematic and aesthetic concerns. Now, as far as the Russian range is concerned, the exception, of course, is Eisenstein, who, in addition to his theories of cinema, especially his theory on the use of montage, was overtly ideological. But the point is that his commitment to his art. Now, just before this talk, I made an attempt the last 15 days to watch all the films of those I'm going to illustrate now. But the point is that when you read his text carefully, when you watch his text carefully, his commitment to art was such, and we do know that in spite of his overt ideological position, it did get him into trouble with the bureaucracy during the era of Stalin. though he used the ideas of Lenin quite openly. Now, this for me registers the fact that even political ideology, when it enters the realm of cinema, functions in accordance with the aesthetic autonomy of the director. So we cannot reduce Eisenstein simply to mean that he was an agitprop, that agit propagandist. But if you look at the textures of his cinema, his works, I will name them a little later, you begin to see that there is a negotiation, that there is a creative confrontation, an encounter between ideology and the layers of the text. What it also means is we know that much as one, the author, declares his or her ideological position, the text may have other layers contrary to consciously declared ideological positions. And if we admit this very important fact, then we will have to create a distance, a detachment between the declared ideology of the writer, of the director, of the painter, of the musician, whoever. We have to necessarily create a distance between the creator and the person who admits to certain ideological positions. Now, this also includes literary figures. The point is, it's interesting to see how even in somebody like Eisenstein, there is a certain aesthetic preoccupation that goes a little beyond his ideological positions. My whole point is that we need to juxtapose, and we certainly need to juxtapose Eisenstein's political ideology with his aesthetic preoccupations. That is, we need to look at his political cultural amalgamation, the amalgamation as proof of his aesthetic autonomy. And I would only name here his film Long Live Mexico. And also the most important fact that you see in Long Live Mexico a great degree of attention towards the Aztec, the Mayan, several dimensions, deep preoccupations with the ontological elements of the cultures of what he was trying to describe. So if we do a careful reading of the text as we ought to, we cannot even read Eisenstein's film through his declared ideological positions. And this is why, for me, a very rich textual analysis of whatever we watch, in this case, the films that we watch, a rich textual analysis is not just limited to meaning, but we broaden our layers of understanding, our frames of understanding, by turning to the manner in which several things are juxtaposed in the piece of art. And therefore, for me, a textual analysis, the text should not become a pretext, that you go with the declared ideological positions and characterize texts, that we try to reduce the expansiveness, the vast expanse of the creative work. In fact, if this is true, one could see it to a greater degree of autonomy can be seen in Dauzenko. And because I'm talking of these people only because they were people who operated with certain ideological patterns, drawing from Lenin and during the Stalinist period, when socialist realism, in fact, writers were controlled by the ideology of socialist realism. But turn to a text like Earth. Now, it is about the arrival of socialism. And to that extent, contemporary politics, historical events, they do matter. In fact, they do figure. But through this collective farming of kulaks, of the rule of collective farming coming into existence in Russia, but through these historical events, Dauzenko, in the text, if you look at the layers of the text, turns to the expansive spirit of nature, the spirit of the earth, in a supremely aesthetic manner. In fact, To watch the film is to recognize the open invocation of a primordial consciousness of the deep ontological elements of life. So for me, it's not surprising that later on, Tarkovsky recognized Dauzenko as one of his supreme masters, one of his teachers. So even when the burden of the spirit of the times is carried, the film texts, now they shape their creative cosmos with fundamental dimensions of human nature operating it. And therefore, these certainly make, my whole argument is a careful reading of the cinematic texts, make it possible for us to arrive at new theoretical readings. It's quite wrong to bring theoretical readings into cinematic texts. They're valid up to a certain point. But more important for me, more challenging for me, is to extrapolate intellectual, ideological, theoretical positions from out of the multiple layers of the cinematic text. By this, we also we confront the overarching, totalizing, and homogenizing theoretical structures. Now, this is very central in these days because having taught film theory for several decades, I find it necessary to record the fact that every viewing of a film, of a single film, helps me arrive at very new theoretical intellectual positions. So it's not that I turn to cinematic texts through André Bazin or the Gestaltists or coming down up to Gilles Deleuze. Much as I would do it as an intellectual position, I would also like to see cinematic texts, creative works, contesting certain positions. And so the challenge is to build refreshingly new theoretical positions out of the layers of the text, which also means saying that creative works, cinema in this case, also helps us formulate new kinds of epistemological positions. It's not that we carry epistemology into creativity. Creative works have the power to create new epistemological positions. And therefore, these shifts in time, which are part of human experience, where the mind travels in time from the present to the past, past to the present to the future. Now, how do we approach these in a linear manner? How do we approach this as if we understand things in a linear and in a chronological manner? You see, if literature talked of the stream of consciousness, I refer to this as the second aspect of the Russian masters after Eisenstein and Dauzenko. If the mind travels back and forth from the present to the past to the future, where everything is mixed up, and in literature we call it stream of consciousness, I would argue that this was not a mere technique. In fact, today if we turn to Christopher Nolan, this is again in operation. But let me not go into other areas. But my whole point is this was the attempt on the part of somebody like Pudovkin to capture. So the cinematic images to capture memory, transitions in time, where the human mind takes a leap from the present to the future, back to the past, back to the present. Now, it's this that Pudovkin was trying to capture through visual images. And these visual images that are imprinted on the human mind. So even when we talk of montage, when we refer to the word montage, we will have to see it through creative and philosophical dimensions and not necessarily through the element of technique. So montage for me is not mere editing where you clip, where you cut and paste, but that you create a whole assembly, and that assembly is something that mixes up zones of time, zones of space, which also means that the range of cinema was extended beyond the boundaries of simplistic rationalism, which also meant that to turn to individuals, we would also have to turn to different layers of consciousness, the manner in which the human mind functions. You see, it is here that I would also talk of how somebody like Vertov, much as he talked of cinema verite, this again was an attempt of to mix up layers of the documentary form with imagination, with memory, with intuition. So even when we say cinema verite, the documentary form capturing the truth is elusive. And to turn to Vertov, his text for me, including Man with a Movie, much of it was quite propagandist. It was an attempt to spread the news, to spread the message. But if you look at it carefully, there's a fusion of memory. There is an entry into layers of consciousness. So even when we talk of documentary, this perhaps explains what we mean by the documentary also being fictional in nature. Even when it comes to the writing of history, history is written by those, and who knows what happened, how it happened, whether it happened exactly as it is described. So quite a lot of it is related to the relative elements of human consciousness. After all, don't we call history itihasa? Thus it is said. But whoever knows what the fact is. So I think there is this important element in Vertov to create documentaries which are supposed to be empirical, factual, but into it inevitably enters the creative element, through intuition, through imagination. Now, this very, very interesting, complex, organic combination of fact, fiction, reality, imagination is something that we must try to unravel. And the whole attempt on my part is to see cinematic text as a combination of this. So when we take up questions, when we take up issues for analysis at a very serious level, what is real? What is reality? What is realism? What constitutes the nature of reality? We run into very deep, complex problems. And these problems lead us to understand issues better. We turn to problems, we confront problems not to find very simplistic, easy answers, but to understand the range of the problem better and better. Now, this is where I find two people of great importance. One is Sergei Parajanov. Also because, for me, there emerges the strong presence of what we recognize as poetic realism, as it does in Tarkovsky. So what is the meaning of the reality? And of course, Parajanov and Tarkovsky, to mention it in brief, to discuss it in brief, talk of poetic reality as something that is factual. In fact, if we read Tarkovsky's Sculpting in Time, Tarkovsky rejects easy poetic realism, which comes as fancy, which comes as very, very easy constructions of imagination. In fact, there is no poetic realism which is not rooted in reality for Tarkovsky. A tree has to be a tree. And what you create out of this is a very different matter. Now, which is why Tarkovsky calls this poetic realism as an experience of the human mind. That is, he uses the word honoric. Now, honoric to mean things that we apprehend, things that we comprehend in a state where we are neither fully awake nor fully asleep. It's a sort of a half awakened, half asleep, dream-like sleep. So if we look at these, if we turn to these, we also begin to understand that there are complex questions of reality, realism, social realism that cannot be reduced to ideological levels. So we need to be open. We need to explore the possibilities of how cinema as a creative element, how cinema as a creative area tries to turn into these things. And therefore, the creative evolution of the cosmos of cinema is a great journey that filmmakers are attempting even to this day. That this curious combination of the real, the unreal, the illusory, of the empirical realities, and that's why A moment ago, I referred to Christopher Nolan. This keeps happening in the sense that this journey, this particular journey of cinema, of the cosmos of cinema, continues even to this day, and it becomes the preoccupation of directors even at the present moment. This is one part of my presentation. And when I talk of the cosmos of cinema, I am also interested in pointing out to the presence of politics, the political element. We talk of politics in cinema, and we talk of the political in cinema. For this presentation, particular presentation, I only turn to some aspects of East European cinema to show how sensitive filmmakers approach history, politics in their films. And in this, what is necessary is to recognize the opposition to authoritarianism, dictatorship, totalitarianism, and these constitute the major dimensions of East European cinema. I would only ask you to think of Andre Vajda, for instance. So I can only give a couple of examples. And his films, Man of Marble, Katyn, Canal, Ashes and Diamonds, Man of Iron, Man of Hope, Stalinist period to the rise of Solidarity, to the rise of Walesa, straight political trajectory. And politics permeates the world of cinema, the world of Andre Vajda. The political landscape, however, what I want to state here is that the political landscape in Vajda, a filmmaker like Vajda, is not merely ideological, but carries all these sensitive dimensions that we associate with a work of art. And therefore, in Vajda in particular, political ideology overcomes the danger of being or becoming propagandist. In fact, the best example to understand this is in Vajda's last work, After Image. It's about the Stalinist period, about the oppression, but it turns to a confrontation with political tyranny through art. It's the protest of art. And here is the relationship between art and politics. The supreme autonomy of an artist, the protagonist of the film, who refuses to obey, to bend down to the whims and fancies of the totalitarian rule. In fact, the painter protagonist in the film only says, there is no work of art, there is no true artist which yields, surrenders to tyranny, to totalitarians. The images of After Image drawn from the life of the painter are, in my opinion, the assertion, Vajda's assertion, that eventually working through historical elements, using ideological positions, being open to ideological positions, a true work of art, and cinema does it in great particularity through visual images, that it's the primacy, the autonomy of the work of art that is eventually vindicated. And this is very important for me. In fact, such a spirit manifests itself in two Hungarian filmmakers that I refer to here. In fact, I turn to Yangso and his films Red Psalm, The Roundup, The Red and the White. Now look at how politics figures, and in what sense is Yangso political? In what sense are his films political? I'll try to explain it a bit. In fact, Yangso deals with political oppression, injustice, but constantly juxtaposing. So I repeat, I'm referring to Red Psalm, The Roundup, The Red and the White. But if one were to ask, what's the eventual vision that emerges? And what's the political vision? So when I use the word political, I don't mean politics. When I use the word political, I mean the ethical dimensions of life, the choices we make in certain situations, and the choices that determine the course of life that's going to unfold before us. So what does Yang So, in a very lyrical manner, in a very poetic manner, he juxtaposes tyranny, oppression, cruelty with innocent peasants, the joy, effervescence of the toilers, the farmers, and when you turn to the red and the white, through the compassion of nurses, medical nurses, who don't recognize enemies, who don't see enmity. And these people, small communities, individuals, easily transcend the traumatic experiences of political cruelty. And Yang So becomes so central because eventually he upholds, he vindicates only innocence and compassion. Now, that compassion, that empathy, that erases the oppression of politics. So Yang So's films have a lyrical quality, a fine element of grace and beauty, but they carry all the democratic concerns of the filmmaker. So lyricism, of poetic realism, these are not superficial transcendental qualities. They emerge out of the thick layers of conflict, bloodshed, suffering, misery. So it's not even a romanticized attitude. These are not romantic visions. And the point is, politics is deeply integrated. Political strife, human suffering, misery is deeply integrated with the dimensions of the art, with the aesthetic dimensions. So what is of great significance are these dimensions of the nature of the times, what I call the spirit of the times. Most important is that they are transmuted. They undergo a transmutation when the creative film directors are in the process of converting them into cinematic images. And this also exemplifies the very complex and organic relationship between history and cinema. But you see, this is the diversity of the cinematic culture. Soviet cinema is not of the same kind. East European cinema, when you turn to somebody like Andhra Vaida, is not of the same kind. Even when you turn to two Hungarian filmmakers, the process is very different. Yang So is of one kind, and the other person I'm going to refer to is Bela Tar. Bela Tar is ideologically very critical of the failure of socialism, of the oppression of Hungary by the communist parties. And Bela Tar, but he establishes a different relationship with the temper of the times, with the spirit of the times, by creating other kinds of visual paradigms in his works. In fact, let us begin with his early work, Family Nest, and then turn to Turin Horse and Satan Tango, the 7-hour-long film. Now, particularly, this is what I mean by the metaphysical element. Bela Tar in Turin Horse and Satan Tango creates magnificent structures, even as they are specifically rooted in specific, particular spatio-temporal realities context. Bela Tar transcends the times, and by looming large, by creating universal paradigms, which I shall explain, by creating timeless experiences, that is, working through the troubled histories of Hungary, Bela Tar gives us the experience of the tragic fate of human beings, the existential angst of the human self, and the human self that exists in states of darkness, agony, despair, and gloom, which is not just of the moment, but of all times. So this existential angst, this suffering, this misery is not related to a specific period, to a specific historical context, but they become paradigms of the human state, of the human condition, of the human state, the tragic fate. This is why you see, it's important to recognize the Turin Horse. I spoke to Bela Tar at Trivandrum last year when he was there. I had a small talk with him. So I was referring to the Turin Horse, Because the Turin horse, as we know, takes us back to the figure of Friedrich Nietzsche. It may be apocryphal, but there is this story of Nietzsche in tearing pain when he sees a horse being mercilessly flogged. And his insanity seems to increase. And when we come from Turin horse with the figure of Nietzsche, and we know what Nietzsche suggests for us, especially in the context of Western philosophy. But when we turn to Satan Tango, we look at the alienated figure in misery, in gloom. So how do we recognize Turin horse, Satan Tango, that's specifically related to a certain historical context? But my argument is, out of this specific historical context, the structures of the film, the layers of the film, also throw up universal paradigms, with Nietzsche being one central figure. And of course, in Satan Tango, you turn to the protagonist in deep despair, melancholy, which signifies, as I mentioned earlier, the state of humankind, the tragic state of human condition. It's very interesting, and I shall only mention it, but this Bela Tar has no regard for Andrei Tarkovsky, because he says Andrei Tarkovsky is too passive, slavish, as a spiritual redemption that we come across in Andrei Tarkovsky, in Solaris to a greater extent, in Mirror, Sacrifice, and certainly in Stalker. Bela Tar recognizes, now this is the plurality, that there are antagonisms within the cinematic structure. He sees Tarkovsky's spirituality as very slavish, but would much rather uphold the films of Fassbinder, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, because he says Fassbinder gives a slap. So there are contrasting positions, there are contrasting images when you turn to European cinema, when you turn to East European cinema. Now the plurality, the cosmos of cinema, what I call the cosmology of cinema, is plural, it's varied, it's diverse, heterogeneous. And this is why I argue that no theoretical position has the right, has the business to homogenize, to totalize, to create overarching structures of these cinematic traditions. Let me briefly turn to the French New Wave, with Godard being the most radical of them. But the most crucial aspect for me is that with the confusion and chaos prevailing in French society, thanks to the divisive polities of Charles de Gaulle, you notice that the French New Wave did turn to fundamental existential questions involving women, men, individuals caught in turbulent times, trying to determine the basis of their being, as the existential philosophers, the existentialists, and the writers did during those times of Sartre or Camus or others, Ionesco, Genet. But the manner in which the French New Wave itself deconstructs itself into two positions, with the right bank and the left bank. And I mean, when you juxtapose the right bank and the left bank, you notice different kinds of structures evolving. And it's impossible to characterize the French New Wave, including, for that matter, the right bank itself. You cannot put Truffaut, Godard, and others together. And when you turn to the left bank with Agnes Varda, Alain Resnais, I must say that there is such a variety in the cosmos of cinema that we need to dig deeper into the specific particular layers of the filmmakers, of their individual films, and look at the diversity that each filmmaker has. I'm not talking merely of the diversity between two filmmakers, but of the diversity, the plurality within a single filmmaker, within the constructs of a single filmmaker. But I must also add here that if there is a certain kind of political radicalism in the works of the New Wave, French New Wave, there's also something very, very important for us to recognize there. In fact, it's Alain Resnais who shows us this. the man who made Night and Fog, who made Hiroshima Mon Amour, also makes other kinds of films where memory becomes important, where he digs into the layers of human consciousness, mixing up past, present, future, making it impossible to unravel the nature of human consciousness. Smoking, no smoking, and certainly last year at Marine Bath. What is Alan Rene, in spite of the left bank was more open about its political position. But eventually, even Alan Rene turns to a very complex area, and that is to discover the unfathomable, inscrutable layers of the human mind. Of course, if you turn to Latin American cinema, I only ask to be pardoned here because I will only refer to a couple of filmmakers and a couple of films. But if we need to look at the cosmos of cinema, of political cinema, greater radicalism can be seen in the Latin American cinema. Salinas, of course, The Hour of the Furnaces, and films like Che, El Salvador, and Toma Alia's Memories of Underdevelopment. My whole point is that this political has moved into greater radical areas in Latin American cinema. And if we need to see how there has been an extensive radical development, I only ask you to refer to Raymond Guevara's Athena, Santiago Maiter's Argentina, 1985, the films of Largely, the films of the Dardenne brothers, also to recognize the fact that the political element in cinema now moves on to embrace not larger ideological questions, but to turn to ethnic, racial injustice. And the Dardenne brothers largely all turn to questions involving the blacks in France, the misery, the attacks on the blacks. So films like Young Ahmed, Les Miserables, and of Nikita and Tori, these are films that are pushing the dimensions, the frontiers of political cinema, becoming more and more radical, showing violence, and they're less aesthetic. But that's a different matter. If they are less aesthetic, it also means the concerns, the preoccupations are more with principles of equality and justice. And to that extent, aesthetic does not seem to matter as much as it did to the earlier generation of filmmakers. But the point is, we also need to categorize these things as very central to the expansive nature of the cinematic traditions. But how do we arrive at different positions when we deal with this expansive tradition of cinema? And therefore, I would also say that we need to look at how a certain, after all that I have said, my attempt hereafter is to look at how the spiritual element also figures to a very great extent in cinema. And there I turn to very important filmmakers like Pasolini, and later on I turn to the Japanese tradition. Whatever one may say of the neorealists, eventually I would have turned to Pasolini and the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, for the simple reason that much as we have discussed about the realism, the concern with the oppressed, the marginalized, the working class, the poor people, there is a certain spiritual position that emerges out of poverty, hunger, starvation, which signifies the indomitable spirit of the common human being. And when I talk of the spiritual, I mean it in a fundamental sense of human beings with dignity, with character, fighting the loss of freedom and fighting for their self-dignity, self-identity. This we can see in Pasolini's The Gospel according to Saint Matthew. And what is this spiritual where the political also mixes, which is part of the mainstream European tradition? and which is part of this whole inexhaustible nature of the cosmos of our cinematic world. And the spiritual functions at a very rooted political historical level. And Pasolini comes later on, but let us look at Karl Dreyer, The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, and Bresson, Balthazar, The Trial of Joan of Arc, and especially the diary of a country priest. What I'm trying to suggest is that the deep preoccupation of cinema is with politics, certainly with history, but there is also something of the very fine transcendental spirit. And that's why you see Fellini said, New Wave is not just a cinematic movement for us. It's a spiritual quest. It's a spiritual search. But how do I concretize it? I concretize it, I try to conceptualize it through the words of the dying priest in the diary of a country priest, where he asks for absolution. And the person who gives absolution does not know whether it's right or wrong. But the priest says, after all is grace. There is nothing beyond grace. These are details. But what am I trying to suggest? My whole position is that the structures of spirituality in the cinematic traditions, that the layers of spirituality in the cinematic traditions come through historical political layers, but more importantly, working within the framework of religion, they are also attacking institutionalized religion, the dark puritanism of institutionalized religion. And this is where religion and politics get intertwined. Now, this particular approach in the cinematic tradition is very important for me, because when it turns to religious structures, religious layers, it's very important not to lose sight of two things: of justice, of freedom, of human dignity, and eventually, if we can use the word in a secular, rational sense, of redemption and salvation for human beings. And redemption and salvation do not necessarily come through those lords and masters of the church, of institutionalized structures. Now, this is the kind of redemption that's important for me, which was being worked out at different levels by Bresson in a very ascetic, austere manner. What this leads us to understand is the fact, I'm going to mention a couple of films, is that this preoccupation with this corruption, degeneration, degradation in religion, the politics of religion comes very clearly, even in films made in recent years, a couple of years ago. And I mention only a couple of them. One Step Behind the Seraphim by Daniel Sandhu, Magdalene Sisters by Peter Mullen, Corpus Christi by Jan Komasa, and in a very comical manner, the film God Exists, Her Name is Petrunia by Mitevska. In fact, especially in the Romanian trajectory, and we know the recent history of Romania, especially after Ceausescu. These are about the huge contradictions. Why do young filmmakers 5 years ago, 6 years ago, turn to religious structures, religious patterns? The struggle is still going on. The struggle for human dignity, salvation in a very secular, rational sense, and to fight the ugly puritanism of decadent religious institutions. So when I turned back to Bresson, Dreyer, I'm extending it to show that 5, 6 years ago, filmmakers of our own times, recent times, are also dealing with these fundamental religious questions in a political, ethical manner. So this story of this struggle with hierarchies, with institutionalized structures, is part of the experience of cinema and continues even to this day. Which is also my argument that this range, this spiritual tradition, should also lead us to construct newer theoretical structures about cinema, about imaging, about narrativization, And it is not that we approach cinema through theories. I have been repeating this, but a different formulation, a different philosophical formulation is possible when we turn to theories through cinematic structures. And this is very true, especially when we turn to what we recognize as post-colonial societies, third world societies. And I refer to this phenomenon, which means I'm moving from the European tradition, from the European context to our own traditions. But let me begin with a closer reading of, to the extent possible in this given lecture, to Japanese cinema. My whole point is, without an understanding of the philosophical, of the deep philosophical layers that influence the works of people like Mizoguchi, of Kurosawa, of Kobayashi, and I only name Sancho the Bailiff, Rashomon, and Rebellion, 3 films by these 3 filmmakers, it's impossible to arrive at a theoretical understanding of cinema without a recognition of something primary to these filmmakers, their fundamental orientation in Buddhist philosophy. The whole of Sancho the Bailiff, the images, the aesthetic structures, the layers, the narratives, and the experiences of these individuals, all these constitute the layers of Sancho the Bailiff. It's impossible to arrive at any cinematic theory without a recognition of what creates these dimensions of cinema. In other words, it means there are certain dimensions that emerge, philosophical, intellectual, experiential dimensions that emerge out of cinematic text, which we need to extrapolate, which we need to draw upon, and then arrive at new theoretical premises. To put it in other words, we are in a position, if we are sensitive enough to understand the layers, textures, the complex fabric of cinema, we are in a position to break through, to go beyond, to resist the canons of theory, the canons of certain theoretical positions, and arrive at new theoretical formulations. And these theoretical formulations come from the creative possibilities of cinematic text. This is the reason why, in the Indian context, it was the great Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay who remarked that cinema is as great and excellent an art as the other first-rate arts. And therefore, for Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, when he made this statement, he said, our business is to look at the layers, the structures built into the narratives, the aesthetic structures, the imaging patterns of cinema, which we cannot regard as secondary to literature or any of the other arts. This is the reason I'm trying to argue that we need to arrive at certain fundamental positions, that we need to arrive at theoretical positions, and this is the business of this ought to be the business. If this is not, this ought to be the business of those who teach cinema, film theory, cinematic theory, film studies, as it is loosely called. And it would not do to dump theories on cinematic texts. I will move a little closer to our context, to our situation. And there I will be quite selective and only turn to certain traditions. And I will make references to Bengali cinema to begin with, turn to Malayalam cinema, Kannada cinema in brief, and talk of the newer dimensions that are being explored by very important young independent filmmakers. So the last part of my presentation will turn to Bengali cinema, 3 or 4 major figures, Malayalam cinema, Kannada cinema in brief, and some very important young independent filmmakers. Why do I do that? Let me refer to Mrinal Sen, Ghatak, and Satyajit Ray. India was an independent country, had gained its freedom, had become a post-colonial society, but look at the trajectories of these 3 directors. And if you look at the trajectories of these 3 directors, you will look at the differences. There are many things that overlap, but let us look at the differences between Ray, Ghatak, and Sen. And this for me is the diversity, not just of Bengali cinema, but of Indian cinema itself. And therefore, I'm trying to argue to go beyond the simplistic reductionist patterns with which we characterize films, including Indian cinema. And this is also the point for me. I'm not going to mention all films, but it's also the point for me to suggest that we had better give up this whole distinction between regional cinema and national cinema, because each film in a particular linguistic tradition comes from a specific universe. To speak a language, to understand a language, to understand the images, the metaphors, the idiom of the language is to understand a particular universe. So we have universes, as it were. What are the things that, the historical things that Sen, Ghatak, and Ray inherited? The horrors of partition, trauma of partition, the existential struggles common to all their films, the existential struggles of human beings in the modern Indian nation state. And these are treated in three different ways by these three filmmakers. In fact, Ghatak is the one who moves into other layers beyond the historical. If you look at Suvarna Rekha or Mega Dakatara, in fact, you will notice, I was watching it 4 days ago, a very, very interesting attempt on Ghatak's part to bring into his cinematic text layers of the collective unconscious, which I think, which I feel he borrowed with his leftist leanings and with his understanding of Jung, the collective unconscious. So even as Ghatak is telling the story of an individual, of a woman, of a female protagonist, what is important is that he sees that individual as part of the collective unconscious, inheriting the burdens of humankind, of the periods of those people. In this sense, the trauma of partition that affected Ghatak is characterized, is something that finds expression through the creative layers that creates universal paradigms, which means that from the local, the specific, the particular, we move to universal patterns. When we use the word universal, it should not be seen as a contradiction of, as a contradiction to the local and the specific. It's out of the particular, the specific, that the universal emerges. In this sense, for me, Ghatak is as important as, if not more important. In fact, we are not creating a hierarchy of artists. To turn to Ghatak, the trauma that Ghatak portrays is, for me, the first move towards the traumas of partition that Saadat Hasan Manto tried to capture in his writings. So I easily turn to two artists of the period, look at commonalities, look at differences. And it's equally interesting to see how there was a very important overlap between Mrinal Sen and Ray. In fact, if you look at their films, it's as if they were making films to match each other. Just watch Mahanagar, Pratidvandi, Seemabadda, Jana Aranya, and contrast them with Interview, Calcutta 71, Padatik, Akaler Sandane. You begin to see that there is such an overlap because they were functioning within the same historical period, sharing the same burdens, but the narratives are contrasting narratives. The perspectives are different even when they emerge from the same context. Now, this is the range, these are the dimensions of the cinematic cosmos. The same historical period, they are the inheritors of the same problems, but the approaches to cinema, the approaches to cinematic narratives are extremely different. So after the aftermath of independence, with all the dismal failures of the ruling state in a free India, the concerns of the two authors, the concerns are the same. And both of them approach the indifference and opportunism of the middle class, of the ruling class. But eventually, their moves, their cinematic moves, they converge at a certain point, but they differ. They differ in the sense that Satyajit Ray sticks to a particular class of society, whereas Mrinal Sen moves into the working classes, moves into the areas of the marginalized, the oppressed. But does the vision essentially differ when we raise basic ethical questions? My whole point is it's also necessary to bring into our cinematic analysis, without making any compromise as far as aesthetic parameters are concerned, fundamental ethical questions. My whole argument is when you turn to Ghatak, Ray, and Mrinal Sen, those parameters with which we analyze, understand European cinema, those parameters do not operate here. So we need to evolve different theoretical frames. We need to evolve different modes of understanding when we turn to the Indian tradition. It's almost like saying we cannot understand, evaluate Indian writers, Indian poets, novelists, as we do when we turn to American writers or European writers or Latin American writers. Now, it is this anarchy of criticism, anarchy of theory that I'm really asking for. Unless we create an anarchic theoretical state, we will not be able to open up new dimensions as far as our own cinematic traditions are concerned. And therefore, Indian cinema, for me, brings us face to face with new histories, new realities. For me, an Andre Baza would certainly not be important here. A Rudolf Arnheim would not be important here. I may find place for the Gestaltist, Arnheim, but certainly not Christian Metz. Münsterberg, I may find a place because they were dealing with the universal dimensions of human consciousness, of the Gestalt. If I turn to Deleuze, I may not find much space for Deleuze, unless I happen to be a theorist in an academic structure where I'm obliged to teach. So there is also this compelling obligation that emerges in me through these filmmakers, through these exceptional filmmakers who ask me to go beyond my own intellectual formulations, my own theoretical positions. And as I said earlier, the challenge for me is to open up newer theoretical possibilities. And the filmmakers, the creators themselves offer us these creative possibilities. This is where the unfamiliar in the Indian cinematic tradition, this is where the unfamiliar and the familiar meet. And when we turn to Bengali cinema, Rituparno Ghosh traces one trajectory, and very recent filmmaker, very young filmmaker of great consequence, making some very important films, Atanu Ghosh. Now these are people, these are the new filmmakers, especially Atanu Ghosh, who asks us to create newer dimensions of theoretical possibilities. And it's the most invaluable experience for people like me. There are many who share this, who share this view that we should not fit theoretical positions into cinematic texts. And the problem is to do away with canonical theoretical positions. Look at the range of Indian cinema when we talk of the cosmos of cinema turning to Indian cinema. Films from the Northeast, remarkable films from the Northeast. And I've been watching films from Assam, Orissa, Manipur. And how does one come to terms with the films of the Northeast? In fact, you cannot even have a theoretical position that would talk of films from the Northeast along with Ghatak, Ray, and Mrinal Sen. So there are layers and layers of theoretical positions that need to be extrapolated. Turn to Aribam Sham Sharma, especially his Ishano, Sanabi, Imagining Them. Turn to Babendranath Saikia, Janu Barwa. Now what yardstick would we approach these filmmakers with? So even when we talk of the Northeastern trajectory, in fact, I've just finished reading two books, one on the history of Assamese cinema and one, quite a pioneering work, on the history and growth of Oriya cinema, you begin to see newer structures, and these newer structures do not come out of theoretical positions, but come out of new endeavors, new journeys, new attempts. How can I leave out South Indian cinema? Not as an act of concession, not out of chauvinism, but to show how rich this tradition is. And I would only ask us to consider Adur, Arvindam, to trace the trajectory of Malayalam cinema. And in this context, I would also mention John Abraham's Amma Ariyan to give you a glimpse of the range of Malayalam cinema. But the mark of Malayalam cinema, in spite of the presence, the dominance of the leftist ideology, the mark of Malayalam cinema, as it is of all great creative filmmakers, is that it does not allow any social, political, religious ideology to choke its creative explorations. In fact, it's quite a rewarding experience to recognize this diversity and plurality of Indian cinema. What I find also interesting is when I turn to Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen in particular, critiquing the communist movement. Not a leftist in ideology, Adur does the same. Now, you see, these are the parallels. These are the continuities and the rich divergences. So if I look at Padatik, if I look at Calcutta 71, in fact, if I turn with an awareness of Adur, if I turn to Mrinal Sen, or from Mrinal Sen, if I return to Adur, I find Adur doing it in a very different manner in Mukhamukam, in Kathapurusham, where there are similarities, where there are similar trajectories, but more important is to recognize the fact that with these apparent similarities, the creative explorations create worlds of diversities. So if there is this Bengal experience, there is this Kerala approach to the same kind of leftist experience, and the film registers are not of the same kind. Now, it is this rich heterogeneity, it is this plurality that we must recognize. And when we recognize this heterogeneity and plurality, do we arrive at newer, more creative, more imaginative theoretical possibilities? Look at Arvindan, especially in Kanchana Sita. Now, this is the trajectory that Arvindan takes up, moves into. Kanchana Sita is a very conscious subversion of the epic, the Ramayana, because here he turns to a tribal landscape, transforming the very destinies of the epic characters and showing. So this is Indian cinema, Malayalam cinema, Arvindan's take on Indian culture, Indian tradition, that there is no single defining theoretical position as regards Indian culture, Indian past, and the Indian epics. So you cannot even construct. So it's not just a relationship with politics, cinema, and religion. It's also with a monolithic construct of Indian past and its cultural and religious traditions. The cosmos of cinema, therefore, has to be recognized for its multiple dimensions. And these multiple dimensions that really contradict the singular constructs of cultures and traditions. Or turn to that great character, Estepan. If Bresson turns to one kind of a spirituality in his films, Balthazar or The Diary of a Country Priest, in Estepan, one sees Arvindan dismantling all dogmatic positions and fostered again by decadent institution through a maverick, through a wanderer, through a Jangama. Arvindan arrives at a very alternative notion of spirituality. And these are elements of Indian cinema, not just of Malayalam cinema, that ask us to understand cinema through historically rooted spiritual transcendental qualities, dimensions. And therefore, Aravindan, for me, provides a sharp contrast to the paradigms we come across in European cinema. So the whole range of cinematic cosmos, so in fact, we should be saying cosmoses, violating rules of grammar and language. And therefore, what is important is this is also the opportunity for us to discard, to seriously reject this whole juxtaposition between unfortunate and uneven and unjust juxtaposition between regional cinema and national cinema, as if there is any national cinema, or as if Hindi is the national cinema. In fact, it's absolutely necessary to state that one of the most volatile aspects of Indian society, and in fact, it is this volatile aspect that we need to uphold, especially in these days, that these volatile aspects also come into the cinematic trajectory. The aesthetics may not be good. What I'm referring to is the reconfiguration of this whole notion of the sociological treatment of jati, the caste, in sociological terms. If sociology has its own problems with the defining jati, it's so very interesting that the most volatile, the most contentious aspect of Indian society comes into the cinematic framework. And the aesthetic parts of the films may not be very good, may not be very rewarding and rich, but can you ignore cinema's preoccupation with one of the most fundamental, volatile, and very violent aspects of Indian society? This is what Tamil cinema does and has been doing in recent years. Just turn to Kaka Muttai by Manikandan, Alagar Sami in Kudurai by Susindran, Padierum Perumal by Mari Selvaraj, Jai Bhim by Jnanavel, Karnan again by Mari Selvaraj. I again repeat, they may not be films of fine or with fine aesthetic qualities. But then, when I write on Indian cinema, when I write on Tamil cinema, now with what position, from what framework do I turn to these films? Or do I just dub them as inferior, mediocre films? Or do I just uphold their political radicalism? Do I vindicate them, support them only because of their political radicalism? What I'm trying to suggest is these categories create great problems for those who write on cinema. Are we to uphold films only because they're very radical, because they deal with the caste system in such an open manner? Do we temper our political radicalism when I write on them? Do I temper it with my aesthetic structures, with my aesthetic understanding? What is the balance that I need to create between political radicalism and my aesthetic sense? This is not a question that's going to be resolved, but all I'm suggesting is cinema, Tamil cinema in particular, creates problems for me. It's easy to run them down because they are not aesthetically very pleasing, very pleasant. It's very easy to uphold them, resorting to some ideological position, bringing in some figure. But what does one do with this dimension of cinema? If I'm a serious viewer of cinema, how do I hold these positions intact without simplifying anything? In other words, how do I construct a theory of cinema that upholds aesthetics with political, with ideological radicalism? This is not a question that's going to be settled easily. I move towards the very last part by saying that we must also look at the kind of relationship, special relationship, which cinema has had with literature. There are many examples, but I turn to one example closer home to my own home state when I talk of the works of Girish Kasravalli. For obvious reasons, which I'm sure you will grant, I cannot go beyond these illustrative pieces. My whole point is that it's in Girish Kasravalli that you see a very important transformation, transmutation of the word into the visual image. In fact, Girish Kasravalli's relationship with literature is quite a tentative one, is quite an open one, in the sense that even a mediocre work of art in the literary world, he picks up and puts into it, brings into it extraordinary visual elements. And those visual elements, mind you, those visual elements carry traces of history. In fact, there is no film of Girish Kasarvalli's which is not a direct response, a creative response to the spirit of the times. In other words, sociological dimensions, political dimensions, communal dimensions undergo a reconfiguration and they become part of his aesthetics. This is his relationship with politics. Girish Kasarvalli is not a political filmmaker in the conventional sense. But does one ignore the politics of his works of art? A turn to Ghatashraddha, based on Anantmurthy's famous story Ghatashraddha. Turn to a very ordinary literary text. In fact, it's a mediocre literary text, Tai Saheba. Or turn to the short story Hasina, which became a film, another short story, Kurmavatara. Now, the point I'm trying to make is the literary value of the text is not central to Girish Kasarvalli. What is central for him is the manner in which the word can be rendered in the form of powerful images, visual images, but those visual images are not an end in themselves. Those visual images must carry resonances, must become echoes that capture the spirit of the times. This is the relationship between literature, cinema, and the spirit of the time. So the story keeps on unfolding. The story does not stop. I could go on and on, but I must end by referring to the new horizons. As I said a little while ago, I cannot end without making a reference to the very significant journeys, the great creative explorations being made by young independent filmmakers. The point is they're making films in their own languages. But this is where they become Indian in content, in spirit, and aesthetics. We cannot, I'm much against the use of the word pan-Indian, that actors come from other languages, that the story moves in all kinds of, there's nothing pan-Indian. There is nothing pan-Indian which is not deeply local, rooted in a specific linguistic cultural context. This whole notion of pan-Indian has to be dismissed. And what is it that is pan-Indian? Every bit of this country, every segment, every unit of this country is Indian in its spirit, in its content. So I think this artificial division is broken by these young filmmakers. And that's why I have selected young filmmakers from several languages. Pradeep Kurba in the Kasi language. Ludu. These are all filmmakers who have been making films the last 7 or 8 years. Ludu. Fahim Irshad. Ani Mani. Kisle. Aizehi. Pratik Vats. Ib Alevu, Haubam Pavankar, 9 Hills, 1 Valley, and the magnificent film by Prabhas Chandra, I Am Not the River Jhelum, Achal Mishra in Maithili, Gamakgar, and Miransha Nayak, located in Goa, Wat and Jews, again in Maithili, Parth Saurabh, Pokar Ke Dunu Par, and then Avinash Arun, 3 of us. And of course, the Marathi filmmakers, beginning with Sumitra Bhave and Sunil Saktankar through Bhaurav Karade, Kwada, Nagraj Manjule, Fandri, and several others. The point I'm trying to make is that Indian cinema, especially through these young filmmakers, independent filmmakers, is expanding its horizons, asking it to look at the plurality of the Indian context and to see a film in Maithili, in the Kasi language, in Oriya, in Assamese, is to behold the Indian experience. Because there is no part of India that is not centrally related to India as a whole. So there is not even a single India. India does not even exist as a homogeneous category. So do I define Assamese cinema merely as Assamese cinema? Oriya cinema, Neeraj Mohapatra's cinema. So how do I begin to look at the Indian text? Just as we read literary text, is a Bengali novel merely a Bengali novel? Is Premchand merely rooted in his culture? This not as an act of concession, but as a recognition of the infinite possibilities of cinema. We must recognize, we must open up, we must open ourselves up to the pluralities of Indian cinema. And that is why it is necessary to understand, to recognize newer issues of form. In fact, all these filmmakers and their films I have mentioned are dissimilar in narration, in form, in content, and ultimately the meaning. Such dissimilarities, so they don't converge. If they do converge, they converge only as experience within us. But we need to raise hundreds of questions, infinite questions about issues of form, content, meaning, and experience. But this leads us, I cannot leave it out, though I cannot discuss it. I cannot leave out these questions of form, meaning, and experience, which operate at a very different level. And that is for another session. When we turn to makers like Mani Kaul or Kumar Shahani or Kamal Swaroop, what do we do with this? These are filmmakers who operate at a different level. Do we bring them together? So there is a whole range of Indian cinema, Indian cinemas that ask us to create newer, meaningful, expansive, imaginative, intuitive categories of understanding, which means that the possibilities for theorists are immense. The possibilities are infinite in nature, provided that the cinematic texts matter to them, that the autonomy of the cinematic text becomes far more important than dead, sterile, barren theoretical positions. Or I can't leave out that Gujarati film by Ketan Mehta, Bhavni Bhavai. So if I keep on giving examples, if I can give 100 examples, why not 100 more? Another 200 or 300, but that becomes a futile exercise in the context of this talk. I end only by saying that we must certainly recognize the range, the most important range of Indian cinema. But the final point I would make is, let us look at how this phenomenon of the post-colonial world, the so-called third world, spreads itself out in various forms. I only say, let us go back to the African filmmaker Usman Sembine and look at his Black Girl, Hala, Mulade, Mandabi, but that's not my point. The African register is of one kind, but more interesting for me is that this question of looking at those who have always been outside the framework, those who have been living at the edge, now these become central to films. These become important to films. For example, the stories, the plights of the Aborigines. Why does a German filmmaker like Herzog try to attend to this in Where the Green Ants Dream? Why does he have to turn to these? Which means that this so-called trajectory of the post-colonial third world cinema is moving in new directions. And filmmakers from all over are trying to come to terms with this. And there is, therefore, a certain unifying universality. There is this universality that emerges through specific, particular, sharply defined historical context. So my whole point is, films address the spirits of their times. Spirits are, the spirit of cinema is located in specific historical times, in particular specific spatio-temporal realities. And it's because of their deep engagement, their rootedness, their grounding in specific spatio-temporal realities, the temporal, that the films through their registers, aesthetic registers, philosophical registers, attain this element of universality. We need to negotiate between the local and the universal, between the specific and the global. That, I think, is the challenge for people who are passionate, who are serious, who are committed to cinema and its future. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me.
Thank you. Vidyashankar, please summarize and please unmute yourself. Please summarize and convey thanks.
I don't think I can summarize that because it's almost a 90 minutes talk and he has covered about the entire cosmology of cinema, what the title he had given. He has fully justified why he chose that title and other things. And I will leave it to the listeners who have listened to this today's lecture. And I think I have proved right, the kind of knowledge systems Manu engages himself is very evident from what he spoke today about. It's not about cinema, it's about the whole human activity he included in talking about cinema. Thank you, Manu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Premendraji. Thank you, Vidyashankar. And I thank the members of the executive committee for inviting me. In fact, it has been a great struggle for me. So many of my formulations, many of my attempts to find expression to my ideas were still very tentative. In fact, I was struggling with myself. But thanks Premendraji, and thanks Vidyashankar in particular.
Also to all the audience also who are there.
Yeah, thanks to who have attended this program, and this will be available at a later time in YouTube also. And we are not taking any question and answer in this session. If you have anything, you can always talk to Manu directly, or you can through Fipresci, you can approach him. Thank you very much for that. Joining us today. Yes, Premendra.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We close the meeting now.